Now you can give it right back to her?
Yeah, I plan on it.
Exactly. Break this off your face there.
Does your daughter live here in Richland? Or?
She lived right across the street from me.
Oh, does she? Oh, there you go. Well, you can really give it to her then. She can't avoid you.
Well, in fact, we worked together
Oh,
at Hammer.
I'm rolling. Oh, okay. Great. All right. Well, I think we're ready to get started.
Okay.
So let's start by having you say your name and also spell it for us.
My name is William T. Tyler, WILLIAMTTYLER.
And you go by Bill or?
Bill, yeah.
All right. And today's date is August 28th of 2013, and we're conducting this interview on the campus of Washington State University Tri-Cities. So let's start, if we can, by maybe having you talk about what brought you to the area. When did you come to work at Hanford, and what brought you here?
We came out here on vacation from Oklahoma in 1947 to see my dad's brothers and sisters. And we were going to stay for a week or so. And my dad applied for a job here and got it, and we stayed. I thought it was the end of the world. This was not a pretty place in 1947. But I went in the Navy in 1950, got into the nuclear program, and came out here in 1955. Went to work at Hanford. Worked as a HPT till 82, I believe, and then I went into management in health physics.
So HPT, you mean health physics technician? Is that what HPT is?
Uh-huh. Sorry.
That's okay. So how old were you when you, 1947, when you came on vacation?
I think I was 15.
Okay. What sort of job did your father get?
He worked in transportation.
And you already had aunts and uncles.
Mm-hmm.
in here.
Yeah.
So you said you thought this was the end of the world. What do you mean by that? What are your first impressions of the place?
Well, my first impression is we got here July the 5th. And my aunt and uncle had a little cafe on downtown Kennewick, on Kennewick Avenue. And it was about 104 degrees out. And we were driving down the street looking for it. And my dad says, "Man, I wouldn't live here, but it's the last place in the world." And, you know, and back then there was not a lot of trees. There was in Kennewick and a few in Richland, but every time the wind blew, it was dusty and the tumbleweeds flew, and a lot of dust storms. In fact, they call them termination winds because everything was booming out in Hanford, and every time the wind blew, people didn't like that, and they'd just pick up and quit. So they called it termination winds.
Do you know when your aunt and uncles came here? Or?
My aunt was born here in Kennewick.
Oh, okay.
My uncle came out here in the 37, 38, somewhere along in there.
Oh, okay. So you had relatives here for before the Hanford site. So.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So when your family first came in 1947, your dad got the job and you stayed here. Where did you live?
We lived in Kennewick for a year, and then we got a house in Richland in 1948 at 635 Basswood.
Was that a government home then?
Uh-huh. It was a ranch house. And we moved in Thanksgiving Day of 48. And my future wife moved in next door the same day. I didn't know that was my future wife, but it turned out to be. So, and I still live on Basswood, different house, but
So, did you go to high school here then?
I went to Kennewick. I started in Kennewick because that's where we lived, and I didn't want to transfer. So I rode the inner city bus every day to Kennewick and back. I graduated in 1950, and then somebody in Washington wanted me to join their services.
So how would you describe, other outside of your first impressions now, how would you describe the community of Richland in late 40s, early 1950s?
It actually, it was a very good place to live. I didn't realize it at the time. It was a smaller, much smaller, probably 5,000 people in each of the cities. It was a good place to live if you could ignore the wind blowing and the dust storms and that sort of thing, but it kind of grows on you. I wouldn't live anywhere else.
In those early years when you were here in the 40s and 50s, you remember any particular community events that stand out in your mind?
Yeah, Atomic Frontier Days, the Grape Festival in Kennewick, and then the fair. Nothing big or spectacular, but it was, something to do.
Can you describe Atomic Frontier Days a little bit? What sorts of things?
Well, normally that was, they had a queen and a parade, of course. And it was just kind of I don't know how, just a parade and kind of a get-together type thing for the people that lived here.
So let's talk about your work a little bit now. You said you started working in 55.
55.
So can you talk about who you worked for at the time and a little bit more detail about what sorts of work you did? What area of the Hanford site you worked at?
I started February the 22nd, 1955, and my first work assignment was 200 West Area Tank Farms. And then I went up to the Radox facility, which was a separations facility, a couple of months later. Then I went to U plant, and then I went to T plant, which were all separations facilities. And then I went over to Purex in December of 1955. That was prior to startup. And we started up, our first spiked run was, I think, March or April of 56. And I worked there till 62, I believe. But in the when I worked there, we also switched with the 100 area HPTs or RCTs or radiation monitors for exposure reasons, because they got a lot more exposure than we did, so we would switch with them. And I got to work in all the 100 the reactors except N when they were running, and some of the 300 area.
So just about everywhere.
Yeah, I've worked basically in every facility out here except 234.5.
And so was GE the contractor? What contractor did you work for?
GE. They were the prime contractor. And they left here in 66, I believe. And Rockwell and Westinghouse and Fluor Daniel and MSA.
So as a health physics technician, what exactly did that mean? What sorts of things did you do on a daily basis?
Well, as you know, there was a lot of contamination radiation. And our job was to set the dose rates if people were going into a radiation area. We would go in, set the dose rates, stay with them, make sure that the dose rates didn't increase while they were in there. We surveyed them out when they were done with the GMs and alpha detectors to make sure they didn't take any contamination home with them. And that was our prime responsibility. We maintained control of personnel exposure rates and their contamination, if they had any, and made sure that everything was as clean as we could get it. That's the short and sweet version.
Yeah. And you did that, obviously, at all these different areas you worked at.
Everywhere,
on the site.
inside, outside, burial grounds.
Were there ever any incidents while you were doing this where people had excessive exposure or anything along those lines? Or
Yeah, there was a lot of them. When GE came here, when they were the prime contractor, back in those days, you really couldn't talk about your job. You could say that you worked at Hanford, and that was pretty much it. But yes, there was a lot of good memories and bad memories. Some really high exposure rates, almost on a daily basis, because everything was running, and what will go wrong probably does. And it was very interesting work. It was something different every day.
Yeah.
It's the kind of job that you look forward to doing and working. I did. I enjoyed it.
So what was the process or procedure if someone had an overexposure?
Well, you had your dosimetry, which Battelle read that, so you know what they got. And that's the record that's with you forever. At that time, I think we worked. We worked under a 50 millirem per day limits, or 300 a week. And sometimes you would exceed that. But we were issued dosimetry every day when we came to work. And you had a film badge, which was read I think once a month. But they kept a running record of your exposure. That's why when 100 area radiation monitors Hello. Can I call you back in? Okay, thanks. Sorry. I don't know how to turn it off.
So we're talking about the dosimeter.
Yeah, they kept records of all your exposures. And then every month they would send you a copy or let you know what it was. But if you, before the end of the year was out, if you were running short of exposure, then they would transfer people, particularly the radiation monitors, to different areas. And what they were doing was using our exposure and letting their people cool down a little bit. It was just a way of equalizing the dose rates to the personnel. And it worked good in theory, And there was some, and I probably shouldn't say this, but there was some little minor ripples in the water because people accused the other people of hanging back and, like, now I got to come save you, that sort of thing. But it was all in fun. Everybody knew how serious the job was, and that was just part of the job.
And so how long did you work as a health physics technician then?
I think until 1982, and I went into management in health physics. And I was, at that time they called us managers. Mm-hmm. And I was the manager of East Tank Farms until 1988. And then I transferred over to the West Area Environmental Group and took that over, which my responsibilities were all of the outside radiation contamination areas, burial sites,
Mm-hmm.
89 I retired, came back 3 months later, went to work in the environmental restoration part-time. And I did that until 1995. And then when Bechtel came in, I left there and went back to health physics side and become a health or a evaluator at Hammer for radiation protection, which I still do.
Still work for
2 to 3 days a week.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned earlier the sort of secrecy of some aspects of Hanford. Obviously, secrecy, security were a very important part of it. I wonder if you could discuss that at all,
Yeah,
any ways that impacted your work?
GE had a very rigid plan of how they wanted things to go. And security, of course, was top secret. If you went, and a few people did, they go down and have a beer at the bar and they get to talking. And you never know who you're talking to. And there was cases where people didn't have a job the next morning because security would overhear them, and you were pretty much done. So people didn't talk about their job. They didn't even talk about it with their family. Security was very strict. When you, well, for instance, when you go to work in the morning, or if you're on shift, same thing. You would catch the bus at the bus lot, get on the bus, go through the barricade at the Y, and if I was going to Purex, we'd go up, pull into the front gate at Purex, you'd get out off the bus, go through the badge house, pick up your dosimetry, go out, get back on the bus would pull inside the gate, get back on the bus, go down to Purex, get off the bus, go through their badge house, and they would check your lunch bucket, and all that, and then go into the building. And then in the evening, just reverse that process and back out again. So they were very strict. If you drove your car, you could not drive it past the main gate of East Area. You parked outside. And when you could drive inside, security would check the glove box and the trunk and whatever was in the car. So it was very regimented.
I wanted to ask you about 1963, President Kennedy visited
Mm-hmm.
for the conducting the dedication of the end reactor. I wondered if you were there and have any memories of that event at all.
I was not there because I was on shift at the day, or probably would have been.
Obviously, one of the things that happened in Hanford is a shift from focus on production to focus on cleanup. And I wonder if that shift impacted your work in any way.
Yes. When, like I said before, I was the manager of East Tank Farms, and my office was at Semi Works, which is in 200 East area, which was the pilot plant for Purex. We, the Semi Works was running, and we were doing strontium cesium runs. But then when the edict came out that we were going to phase out, and clean up, one of the first facilities, well, I think it was the first facility that we started tearing down was Semi Works. And D&D did the work, but we shut it all down and demolished the building and just imploded it in place. Built a dirt berm over it, cleaned it up. Most of the cells and the tanks are still in place, but they're full of grout. And then there's concrete over it. And what we did was tear down, this was approximately a 3-story building with 3 stories underground. So when we tore down the building, and a lot of piping and columns, and we tore down the building and left the west wall standing, and we filled everything that we could get inside the basement, and concreted it in place, and then we undercut the west wall, and it's probably 4 foot thick, and got a couple of caterpillars and chains and hooked it over the top of the west wall, pulled it down over like a lid, and then dirt berm over it, and there it is. And the stack that was there, the exhaust, the big stack, they imploded that and laid it right alongside the building. One guy did that.
Really? Wow.
And we deconned it first, and he came in and a dynamite expert told us where he was going to put the stack and put a stick out on the end in the ground like they do now in the TV, and laid the stack right down on that stick all by himself.
So that definitely did make for significant changes then, to shift from production.
Very significant, because that was kind of the pilot test for all the other anticipated deconning and decommissioning they were going to do, which is still going on.
Let's sit down and talk a little bit about HAPO, and I wonder, I know you've been involved with them quite a lot. Can you talk about your involvement when you became involved in HAPO and how that came about?
Well, let's see, first, HAPO was a GE acronym, which stands for Hanford Atomic Products Operations, which was the name of GE's part of this. GISA, which is another credit union down the street, was the General Electric Supervisors Association. GE was very particular about their managers or supervisors were a step above the blue-collar workers. Mm-hmm. And I think they still maintain that. If you were a supervisor, it's a white shirt and tie, and you don't fraternize with. So when the credit committee wanted to get started, that's the name they chose. Just HAPO. And 53. And I was looking at one of the early, the record book. And I think there's 5 or 6 of the charter members of the first that I worked with that were radiation monitors, just like I was. But I never joined HAPO until my wife was, she liked sea first. And I never joined HAPO until, I think, 71. And then a friend of mine that I worked with talked me into getting on the committee that approved loans, credit committee, which I did. And then I got invited later to go on the board of directors, and I got voted in, and been there ever since. It's I've really enjoyed it. It's it's a great credit union.
So is it the board of directors then primarily? Is it either current or former Hanford employees? Is it?
No, it used to be when we were federal, you had to work out here to join HAPO. And then they relinquished or changed the bylaws so that anybody could join HAPO. If you give them $5 and sign up, you were a member for life. But initially it was, you had to work here to join.
And you said you didn't join until 71. What led you to decide to join at that point?
The guy I carpool with, one of them, convinced me that I should do that. and I didn't, I didn't like Seafirst. I never did like Seafirst. But my wife liked him because you got at the end of the month, you got all of your blank check or your checks back, and she liked that. But I joined HAPO and started my own checking account. And then she finally joined shortly after I did. And the rest is history.
So I know you weren't part of the formation of the credit union. But I wonder if you could talk about it a little more, if you know more about, were the employee unions at Hanford involved in the credit union establishing that, or?
Yes.
Anything you can talk about that?
Alan Van Patten was one. But GISA started it first, and then, the blue collars said, well, we got to have one of those. And they were down, the first store was down by the Spud Nut shop. I think we had 1 or 2 employees. And it was, everything was in a ledger, handwritten. Joe Blow borrowed $25. It's very basic. But fortunately it kept growing, and membership increased,
So the union sought as a way to provide credit union opportunities
right.
for blue collar workers or laborers or everything. Okay. So I want to, going back to your work at Hanford, what are some of the more challenging aspects of your work, and maybe some of the more rewarding aspects of your work?
It's a good question. Probably one of the most challenging was the responsibility when you're out on a hot job where the contamination levels are great and the radiation levels are great, and you have a whole crew of people. It's really, it challenges you to, it's always in the back of your mind that something's going to happen and I'm not going to see it, or I'm not going to catch it, and somebody's going to get overexposed. And that's always in the back of your mind. Because, and I have to beat my own drum here for a bit, radiation monitoring and health physics now, whatever they are, it's a very challenging job. You're responsible for, you're taking care of people, and they trust you. And they expect you to look out for them. And it's a lot of responsibility, but most everybody accepts that gladly because they know how important it is. Because you're responsible for, you could get somebody really overexposed, and who knows what the consequences are. As far as the rewards for that, I think is the satisfaction of when the job is done, that you know you did your best job. Nobody got hurt, nobody got overexposed, nobody got contaminated, and the job got done.
Were there any events or incidents or anything, sort of unique things that happened during your time working at Hanford sort of really stand out to you?
When I first hired in, like I said, I went to Radox. One of the problems they had shortly before I got here was they had a ruthenium. They ran some ruthenium and it played it out in the stack. And then it broke loose and it kind of went out in the desert and on the ground, and you had ruthenium chunks of, it looked like white paper that built up on the inside of the stack and then finally broke loose and fluttered out and went everywhere. And one of my first jobs with a GM and a walking stick was walking out through the desert finding these things. Little specks, big specks. You didn't have any trouble finding them. They were very hot. And I remember we used the KOA cans from T-Plant, which were little round cans, metal cans about that big around, about this high, with a snap-on lid. And that's what we put them in with dirt for shielding, and then buried them. But there's been a lot of incidents of hot burials from Purex. I remember some where we used a burial string. We used a locomotive, a whole bunch of flat cars. And then at that time they'd build big wooden boxes. I recall one big one that had enough lumber in it to build 2 bee houses. Huge. It sat on 2 flat cars. And we put it in, and we took readings over the top of the tunnel as it went out of the tunnel toward the burial ground. And it read greater than 500 R. And as you know, 500 R is, for an hour, is a lethal dose rate to 50% of the people, 60%. And then you go down the railroad track, behind B plant, pull it across the highway, which patrol barricaded the road. So you pull the string across the road and then back it into the burial ground. And then you had this box was built on skids. And a big, long steel cable laying on another flat car, 3 or 4 flat cars away from it. So you would pull that, and you would pull it down into a burial trench. And the cat would be down there ready, and the train would back up, and they would grab that cable with the eye on, hook it to the cat, and then the cat skinner would pull the cable off, and the train would move up until the box is set here and the cable's here. And the cat's down here pulling, and then we'd get up to and there was a dock where you could slide it off, and you would turn that box and pull it in, pull it down into the trench, down to the other end wherever you wanted it, unhook the cat, leave it, pull the cat out, and then they would backfill that box. And that's the way they did the burials. And it worked great, except when the box collapsed unexpectedly, and
Then not so great.
yeah, that's not a good. That happened once or twice.
During your years working out there, were you ever concerned about your own safety, health, protection, in any way?
Well, as stupid as it may sound, no, I never was. Because I always figured I knew what I was doing. And I received some very good training in the Navy, which helped.
Mm-hmm.
But I never worried about it. Always trusted me.
Were you a member of a union were you working in Hanford, and what union was that? And I guess then, in addition to that, what sort of relationship did the union have with management here at Hanford during the time you were here?
Good and bad. I used to be chief steward for the radiation monitor. I went through 2 negotiations, and after the last one, I decided I didn't want any more of that. Chief steward's a thankless job, but somebody's got to do it.
What does that mean exactly? I mean, what chief steward?
Well, you're the union rep for plant-wide for all of the HBTs. And I had this grandiose idea that I could just change everything. It's a great idea, but it doesn't work. It's a job that somebody has to do, and it's a job that is thankless, because somebody's always mad at you. Whatever you do, in some of the people's eyes, you could always do better. And it's just not a good job. But I enjoyed it. It's you learn a lot. And you learn both sides of the fence. How the company thinks and how the union thinks, and then you try and compromise.
Was there ever any times you hear there was a strike or any sort of...
2. 66 and 76.
And were those sort of across the site, or were they...
Yeah, and when in 66, after we settled the 66 strike, GE left.
that one of the reasons they left was?
Yeah, they had planned to leave, and then that's when, because when GE was here, they were the only contractor, and then when they left, they kind of broke it up into the 200 areas and the 100 areas, and it's always been different contractors, not just one prime contractor.
Do you remember what some of the key issues were in 66 and 76 in terms of
Wages.
Wages.
Wages were always the key issue. Well, I take that back. 66 or 76 was they were going to do away with the buses. And that was a key issue for everybody. It didn't happen, but it was that's when they spent all the money redoing the bus lot. And then a couple of years later, they did away with the buses anyway, so. But we did get air-conditioned buses before we had old buses, the old green buses. Well, like the one sitting down at the
Crest Museum?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Those were some of the newer ones. The older ones were international buses that looked like a truck.
Mm-hmm.
Cold in the winter and hot in the summer. But they worked.
Mm-hmm.
But when they did away with the buses, see, that did away with a lot of jobs in the bus lot. Maintenance, everything there. Which was a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. So part of that was about jobs and usage of the transportation. Right. Okay. Anything I haven't asked you about that you'd like to talk about or that you think we should talk about?
Well, we've covered pretty much we've covered pretty much everything, I think. But I don't really know what you're looking for.
Just your experience.
Just,
I mean, yeah. And that's why I wonder if there's something that you experienced, some event or something that I haven't asked you about yet that you think would be important to.
When I retired, I took the first early out and then got bored to death and came back. When I was in the environmental group in West area, a good friend of mine was an environmental manager outside site. But he talked me into coming back part-time and become a waste shipper and a waste handler, which was, I'd never done, I knew what it was. But I finally relented, and I enjoyed it. It's entirely different, because I was kind of burnt out on radiation protection. And I wanted to do something different. I didn't want to retire, but I wanted to do something different. So I went to the classes and become a certified waste shipper and a waste handler. And we took care of all of the sites outside of the 200 East, 200 West, all the burial sites, all the drilling sites, the river, pretty much everything. And it was very interesting until 95, when I decided I didn't like the contractor. And I went back to health physics.
most of the students I teach now were born after the Cold War ended. Obviously, most of your career, the Cold War was going on during most of the time you were working at Hanford. So wondering what you think would be important for young people today and people, future generations, to know about working at Hanford during the Cold War.
Well, I'm trying to remember. We had the strike in '66, and there was almost another strike 4 or 5 years later. In fact, midnight was the deadline when we were supposed to go on strike, and at 11:30. We got a notification that the president had put a stop to the strike because of the situation and with the Cold War thing. And I think that's the first and the last time that ever happened. But as far as
So it would have been about 1970 or so?
early, yeah, 71, 72 maybe. No, it was before that, because I was still on shift. It was probably 68, 69 maybe. But as far as the Cold War is still going on in different forms, my personal opinion. You look back at history, and I've lived through a lot of it. Nothing has really changed. Like what's going on now. And the Bible says there'll be wars and rumors of wars, and that's correct. Because, whatever our president does, whatever he does is going to be wrong in a lot of people's eyes. It's kind of like if you don't do it, you should have. And if you do it, you shouldn't have. It's a different type of Cold War. Instead of, we used to worry about Russia. And I'm not too sure that maybe we should still be worrying about Russia. And a lot of other countries that, things have changed, but they haven't. The basic things that caused the Cold War hasn't changed. There's all kind of weapons. I don't know.
All right. I think that's all the questions I have for you.
Okay.
I want to thank you very much for coming in today and
Thank you for having me.
letting me talk to you.